Welcome to our weekly Bible study where we're studying the book of Romans. We're in chapter 8. We're in verses 12 through 17 this week. As always, make sure that you're jumping back into the train of thought because each one of these studies looks not just at the individual verses, but at the larger picture, at the study of Romans as well. So this week we're jumping straight back in where we left off last time. Last time we finished the beginning, verse all the way to verse 11, which is kind of like the end of a section of Paul's argument, right? Paul is making this big argument about the need for salvation, the need for Jesus, how Jesus fulfills the law, how Jesus is the God that we need, the Messiah that we've been waiting on, how he is the one who's going to make us right, how all that works. That's the argument of Romans. That's what Paul's getting at. And chapter 7 through 8, verse 11 is basically how the law failed, but also was successful through Jesus. How under the law, all of us are helpless, but because of Jesus living it out perfectly, killing sin in his own flesh at his death and resurrection, that we are now part of God's people, that we're part of his family. And we have the Spirit, and the Spirit brings life, which was the ultimate promise of the law. So the law did succeed in what it was supposed to do, but not in the way that we would have expected it. Something to remember, too, because it's going to become especially relevant to today's section, is to pay attention to Paul's connecting words, right? That Paul is operating under a big argument. That's the way he writes. He doesn't write like, let's just talk about this, and then we're going to talk about this. He writes, so that it's A plus B plus C equals D. Like, it's big arguments, right? So pay attention to his connecting words. In Greek, it's usually a word like gar, like the fish, right? But it means for or because. It's a conjunction, junction, what's your function, connection words. Pay attention to those, especially in this chapter. And lastly, again, remember to think of the law that he talks about not so much as a set of rules, but as the document that defines the people of Israel, right? So let's keep that in our minds as we go through today's section. So last week we finished up by discussing how flesh is not the physical per se, but rather Paul talks about the flesh as the corruption, right? The thing that sin has twisted away from God's initial design, and so that is our physical bodies, parts of the physical world around us, but it's also our minds, it's also our hearts. Like there are parts of us that are corrupted, are not just the physical parts, not just our fleshly urges, as you hear sometimes say, but you think of flesh as more, it's just the parts of you that are sinful, right? And that can be your mind, that can be your thought life, that can be your heart, that can be your emotions, that can be like all of you can be corrupted. So what Paul basically finished last week by saying is that we have to control, we have to feed the Spirit, the redeemed part of ourselves, and starve the fleshly part of ourselves. So we've wrapped up with verses 10 and 11 where it says, "But if the Messiah is in you, the body is indeed dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of covenant justice." Remember, covenant justice being Jesus making us right. It's typically translated as righteousness, but you're made right before the covenant, the law, the thing that we are all judged by. Okay, got to keep that in mind. "So then, if the Spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead lives within you, the one who raised the Messiah from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies too, through his Spirit who lives within you." Right? So we finished with this idea that Jesus crucified death, crucified sin. Therefore, when we decide to follow him, we have to be crucified so that we put to death that part of ourselves that sin has corrupted. And that's really going to be a big part of what we talk about today. So starting in verse 12 of chapter 8, he says, "So then, my dear family, we are in debt, but not to human flesh, to live our life in that way. But if you live in accordance with the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. All who are led by the Spirit of God, you see, are God's children. You didn't receive a spirit of slavery, did you, to go back into the state of fear? But you received the spirit of sonship, in whom we call out, Abba, Father." When that happens, it is the Spirit itself giving supporting witness to what our own spirit is saying, that we are God's children. And if we're children, we're also heirs. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with the Messiah, as long as we suffer with him, so we may be also glorified with him. Growing up, I'm in my 30s, which makes me a millennial. It was taught to me that you had to go to college. right? That you needed to go to college to be successful, and this wasn't just parents, this was everybody. This teachers, coaches, Sunday school teachers, like everybody, everywhere you looked, you needed to go to college in order to be successful. And so that's what I did, right? Like that was what was drilled into me. I was somebody who was in, the advanced classes or whatever. I was somebody who was smart enough to go to college, therefore I should go to college no matter what. And I did. And so in 2007, I went to college. It was non-negotiable. I went to college to get the degree I thought I needed to do what I wanted to do. And in that process, I do not come from means that my parents paid for my college. That wasn't on the table for us. 5 kids, and my folks are working class people, salt of the earth types. So I had to take on student loans, right? And my first year, I went to a local college, and then I went to a private school where I could get a degree in ministry. That was what I wanted to do. It's what I felt called to do. Signed on those dotted lines, and I know, like, people explain things to me, but I'd never once, not a single time, did anybody say, hey, 17, 18, 19-year-old kid, you're signing up to make $1,200 payments 6 months after you graduate. I just assumed that because I went to college, I would get a good job that paid what, everybody got student loans. You just did that, right? That you would be fine, you would be able to afford it because you went to college, got the degree, and you can, do what you need to do. You can afford it, right? Thing was, if you're familiar with your recent world events, 2008 happened before I graduated college. 2008, the housing bubble burst, and the economy basically went, I don't even know, it just died, right? Like when I graduated college, the jobs just weren't there, especially for a 20-something-year-old who wanted to be a preacher. It just didn't exist, at least not in ones that were viable. There were a lot of church plants that wanted me to come, but they didn't want to pay anything. I had to work another job just to work that job, and it just didn't make sense to me. And there were other things that were happening in my life at that time as well that required me to stay close to home. But basically, I ended up getting a part-time job for $10 an hour, which back in 2012 or 10, 11, that was all right, for a first entry-level job. But then those student loans hit. And I started getting the bills that I owed for them. And it was, as I said, $1,200 a month, which was crazy because I was only making about $800 a month if my boss gave me all the hours I could get. So immediately I panicked. Like, it crushed me. I didn't know what to do. I moved 3 hours away to a bigger city, and I got 3 part-time jobs because that was all I could get. Graduating college with a ministry degree doesn't exactly, get you a lot of job offers at big businesses or anything. So I went and I worked those 3 jobs, and I worked myself to death, over 80 plus hours a week, every week. And basically working like that, I was able to pay my rent in a really, really run-down apartment. I was able to pay my bills. I was able to pay that student loan bill, and that's about it. Most of the time I ate at one of my jobs, which was had a restaurant in it, and I was able to kind of eat for free, eat returned orders and stuff like that, as anybody who's worked in the food industry knows what I'm talking about. That's basically the only way I could survive, and sometimes I couldn't if it wasn't for the help of my parents helping me out, getting me by when I couldn't survive. It was a difficult time in my life, and it set me on a path that made me understand debt like nothing else. To understand what it means to owe and not be able to pay it back. That was where my life was for that period in my life. It wasn't until I was able to get promoted at one of those jobs and move back home and eventually work my way up the ladder there that I was able to finally stand on my own 2 feet. It took a lot of effort and sacrifice. And that kind of debt, it crushes you. Like it absolutely ruins everything in your life. It felt like it's all you could think about. Nothing else mattered because all you knew was you had to pay. Now, maybe some people in that situation could have just shrugged it off or deferred or not paid. That's not how I was raised. That's not who I am. If I owe, I pay. Right? That That's the right thing to do. That's the Christian thing to do. If you sign up for debt, you pay it, right? Like, you shouldn't really go into debt if you can help it anyways. But, sometimes that's the right decision and you pay it. So I had to work for it. Now, if we go back to Paul's day, if we go back to the time of Romans, if this same situation happened to somebody like that, they had a debt that they couldn't pay, they probably wouldn't have been as fortunate. Because I was able to move 3 hours away to a bigger city to find more opportunities. Most people back then, they never traveled that far from home to begin with. It wasn't a possibility. I was educated. I had a college level education. Most people weren't educated. They only knew the trade that they're taught by their parents, most likely. I was able to get 3 jobs that consistently paid me. It wasn't a guarantee for them. Most likely, people back then, if they got into this same situation, they would inevitably, through a couple of different avenues, probably end up in slavery. They would either be thrown in debtor's prison and then subsequently sell themselves or their family into slavery to pay their debt. Or they would just outright sell themselves into slavery. That was about the only way they could get out of this kind of debt. And so when Paul begins this section saying that we are not debtors to sin, that's what he's referring to. That's the weight that he is putting on all of us. That we're not debtors in that sense to sin. We don't owe sin anything. Because when we work to pay debt, it controls us, right? It's the old cliche saying, I owe, so it's off to work I go. Paul starts out this section by saying, we are in debt, but it's not to the debt of sin, because that leads to death. That if we live our life in debt to sin as though we owe it something, then that ultimately leads to our destruction. We'll die. That's what he says. The evidence that we've talked about over and over throughout this series, the evidence that sin exists is death exists. That's what happens when you live life as a debtor to sin. But Jesus set us free from that. We are not debtors to sin anymore. So what are we? So he starts out with verses 12 and 13 by saying that, hey, you're no longer in debt to sin. That whereas before we acted and lived like sin owned us, that we are slaves to it. Remember all those sections we talked about slavery to sin versus slavery to God. That we don't owe sin anything. That we're no longer owned by it. That we don't have to sell ourselves into slavery to it to pay off the debt. We're debt free from it. Matter of fact, Paul says that we have to live in a way where we put it to death in our lives. And this is one of those things that sometimes gets missed in the gospel presentations. When people talk about giving our life to Jesus, that a lot of times they focus on, hey, believe, trust, make Jesus your Savior. And it's like they live out that it requires life change. That when you go to a new job, you have to do what that job requires of you. When you give your life to Jesus and you make him king, he's like your new boss. You have to do what he says. The difference is he's the best boss in the whole wide world. Like, he's not a cruel boss or a mean boss or a manipulative boss. He's a boss who genuinely cares about you and wants the best for you. That's different. That's not the way the world works. That's not the way sin works. But we have to put to death, we have to leave the old job behind. We cannot go back to it. We have to put to death and change the way we live our lives so that we can live the way Christ commands us to. And so if we're not a debt to sin, we're a debt to who? We're in debt to God. Now, this is one of those things that it's not an equal as opposite, right? Like life, the spirit is not equal and opposite to sin, right? That we talked about that earlier in this study. That's not equal and opposite. It's the result of being freed, right? So we are in debt to God, but we're in debt to God the way a child is in debt to its parents, right? If you were raised in a good home, your parents fed you, they sheltered you, they gave you clothes, they probably reminded you of this when you were being a brat, right? Like they did things for you that, you know, they act like maybe in those moments that they didn't have to, but really it's like that's what a good parent does. They make sacrifices for their kids, right? That's what a good parent does. With the hope that that kid becomes the kind of person the parent wants them to be. You know, that's the responsibility of having kids. But in a sense, that kid owes that parent a debt. If your parents were good, they taught you right, they treated you right, they took care of you, they provided for you, yes, you owe your parents a debt. But it's not the kind of debt that you pay back, right? It's the kind of debt you pay forward, right? You in turn raise your kids the right way. You in turn treat people the right way. You live your life the right way. You're in debt to love, and you repay it with love, right? So we are in debt to God because of what he's done for us. It's a debt we can't pay back. We don't pay back. We pay it forward. That's what Paul's point here is that we are set free from a debt that crushes your soul the way those student loans did, that owns you. And instead, we have a debt to God that is all about paying it forward, is all about love, that it is a vocation, that we are a child of God, meaning we're an heir of God. We inherit the inheritance of God. It's back to this idea that what is done for Christ is done for us. Christ is the Son of God. He is the heir of God. He is the King. He is at the right hand, and it is done for us in turn. But the point that Paul is making is we don't just believe it and we're good. It requires life change. Not that life change earns you anything. That's the other temptation of this, is to think that oh, well, I've got to make these changes in my life, and therefore I have to, it earns me, right? Like if I don't do it well enough, God gets mad at me and bad things happen in my life. Like it doesn't work like that, right? You simply are paying it forward what you have been given. You simply are responding the way you've been treated, the way that you live your life as a response to the way your parents raised you. And again, I'm assuming people were raised by parents who did it the right way, and I know a lot of people that's not true. So this might be an analogy falling on deaf ears. But the point here is that if you've been loved, you live your life built on that love. You respond to it. Not that you're trying to earn that love if it's genuine love. No, you respond to it and you live a certain way because somebody has loved you. And that's all that Christ has called us to be. We are the sons and daughters of God. And it's our job, it's our mission to live like that. A slave has an expectation. A son or a daughter has a different expectation, and it's up to us to live accordingly. Hopefully this helps you. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.